We start now. Hello, everyone. I am greeting you from the Wajak people of the Noongar Nation in Australia. I want to pay my respect to the people of the Wajak people of the Noongar Nation here in Perth, the indigenous owners of the land where Curtin University is located. And I want to pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I want to acknowledge that the sovereignty of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people over their land has never been ceded. So today we're joined by friends, colleagues, scholars, brothers and a sister. We're here together to talk about development and also thinking about development from the lens of Africa, as Africans, as people from the continent, and also as people who are working in institutions that have been, or systems, cultures, structures, languages that have been complicit in the colonization of the continent, at least in the past years. So we'll be reflecting on our practice to start this conversation. I would like to invite our participants from South Africa and from UK to introduce themselves. It would be really great if they tell us who they are using their own words in whatever way they want to be known to our public. Instead of the formal institutional introduction, I thought it would be fitting to invite you to say a few words about you and your research, and then we'll move from that.
Well, maybe let me
yes, please.
take the mic, hoping that I'm audible. My name is Lehasa Moloi from the University of South Africa, Department of Development Studies, and I'm a senior lecturer in the field of development. And my areas of research interest relates to questions of decoloniality, but more in particular Afrocentricity. And I hold a PhD in development studies, in which the key arguments I'm making is about decolonizing not just the etymology, not just the field of development studies, but also the question of the practice, but also by situating these reflections within a long history of the denial of the humanity of people of African descent. But I don't just only look at the effects of the past 500 years of the rise of modern Europe from 1492, but I extend myself into the idea of the south of the Nile Valley civilization to deconstruct the entrapping designs of Eurocentrically constructed narrative of the global south, so that we view Africa in its trajectory of the journey it has traveled to the modern time. And yeah, I'm quite passionate about the subject, and to that matter, I published a book forwarded by Professor Molifikete Asante, Developing Africa Towards an Afrocentric Development Paradigm. I think I will pause there.
Thank you. We'll come back to the book and we'll ask you more about these interesting insights. Can I go to Jessie now to introduce herself?
Thank you very much, Yerga. Hello, everybody. My name is Geshi Karuri Sabina. I am not too far from Lhasa, just over, I think, a mountain and a plain in Johannesburg, South Africa. I am at the University of Witwatersrand. More importantly, I am a mother, a child of Africa, a scholar and a practitioner. Coming back to the scholarship, I'm based at the School of Governance, where I'm an associate professor. My background is a bit of a mix of urban planning, urban studies, technology innovation studies, and anticipation studies. And I try to combine these to make sense of what I see around me, having grown up and lived for a long time on the continent. And I'm involved in quite a lot of study, but also networks and movements, trying to look at what we can do in these times. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Desi. Iyo.
Yes, thanks a lot, Irga, for inviting us. My name is Iyo Balchagabramaram. I'm an Ethiopian. I live in the UK. I work at the University of Bristol. I have a background in youth activism, particularly in Ethiopia and across the African continent, engaging with various Pan-African continental initiatives that primarily focus on enhancing meaningful young people's engagement in politics and political processes. That's what kicked off my professional career since I graduated with my bachelor degree 20 years ago from Addis University. My particular area of expertise and research is African political economy, African politics, and also over the past 4 years, particularly the politics of academic knowledge production in Africa, on Africa and about Africa. So primarily focusing on how international research collaborations with African researchers, Africa-based higher education institutions can be used as a leverage point for transformative engagement so that we redress the colonially designed academic knowledge production ecosystem. I'm a father of two, and yeah, that's who I am.
Thank you very much. That's really wonderful, and we'll continue to unpack from where you started about your work. If I also say a little bit about myself, I am Yirga. I'm also from Ethiopia, like Eyob, and Eyob is like a very dear friend, a dear brother to me, whose work really inspires me, gives me great hope, and we work together in Ethiopia. Here, I am at Curtin University as a senior lecturer and director of the Center for Human Rights Education. But today, my role is as the Vice President of the Development Studies Association of Australia. I'm representing the SAAA in this program. And this organization is a very inspiring, dynamic organization that involves so many researchers across the world and is regarded as a peak body in Australia in this field. And as much as possible, we endeavor to include many researchers, many voices, critical reflections on our own practice. And I think this is one of the ways in which the SAA tries to bring critical reflections on the very meaning and practice of development. And I'm grateful that you are here to share your expertise, your views on how we may be able to achieve that. So I think what we will do now is I want to ask you a little bit from some of your own work to reflect on the question in a much more broader way in a sense, because in relation to the very topic we're discussing, it may appear to be a little bit broader or even outside in some cases, but very relevant because knowledge, the future, and young people in Africa, all of these are related to how we conceptualize and practice development. So if I start with you, Gessi, you research on multiple fascinating topics, including what the future of Africans would look like. In your article titled Urban Africa's Futures, Perspectives and Implications for Agenda 2063, you have argued that much of the study and analysis about African development, in that particular case, I think you were referring to urban development studies, is woefully inadequate and unhelpful in charting new ways forward. Also, in a recent work, you argued that reimagining Africa requires epistemic and institutional ruptures. And I think that is very important to unpack. So what kind of bold changes do you think in thinking institutions do we need to make real progress? And how can you involve, how can innovation help us break away from old colonial ways of doing things. So if you just a little bit unpack to us how you were imagining the future, what are the things that are wrong that need to be revisited, reimagined when we think about the future of Africa and Africans?
Thank you so much for this question, Yerga. And maybe let me begin by answering as a self-reflection on an African who was trained as an urban planner in the North. Although I think there's very little difference from urban planners who are trained in the South, which is the place you start matters. So what you believe to be foundational knowledge and what you believe to be foundational assumptions about the way the world works matters in how you therefore understand how you can move forward. In the first article you mentioned on Urban Africa's Futures, what I tried to do there somewhat systematically was to demonstrate that if we were going to start Africa's Agenda 2063 by basing it on an understanding of trends and drivers that would influence the future, an understanding of where we are starting, then you could only move in certain directions. But I was questioning those foundations. I was saying, but if I look at these trends and drivers, first of all, and this is a very typical practice in the work of anticipation or foresight, is you begin by deciding what variables matter to look at. The selection of those variables and the definition of data for those variables across the world comes from 6 countries. What we call mega trends, trends and drivers in the world of futures comes from 6 countries, all in the North. And I tried to demonstrate have very little to do with other considerations and factors that we might think are important. So if you are defined by a particular sense of what economics means, what matters socially, what to think about environmentally, and which technologies matter, and you put yourselves in that box, then the job of planning, the job of development, the job of moving forward can only be from that position. And I really critique this. So I think that we make a mistake beginning, at least for me, what I recognize is from the point of the university, and then from the point of the development project, to, in my view, have an unacceptable and an unhelpful starting point for the conversation. So this was the one thing I tried to demonstrate with that paper. In subsequent work that I've been involved with in trying to understand innovation in Africa and how we can leverage innovation to do so-called development, I think the same theme has recurred, this continuing recognition that there's a real problem with several things. In a recent paper we did, we begin to identify challenges in the very realm and theories of innovation economics that we ground ourselves in, that these are actually unhelpful and limiting in how we begin to understand what potential we bring to the tables. And I give examples from the field of agriculture, for example. If you're told that your practices are completely useless, and what is useful is a particular formulation that is based on property contracts and a definition of freedom, then again, that is the starting point for thinking about the future of agriculture. And it immediately dismisses any practice or knowledge you might have held before. So this was the one that we talk about. We talk about the organizing logic that underpins development, and we talk about the institutions that we build around that. So I would argue that our starting point is wrong. Many of the theoretical frameworks we use are constraining, and then some of the approaches and institutions we therefore set up for the project are problematic. We have to break away from these if we have any hope of doing things differently.
That's wonderful. I think it's what are those 6 countries? Would you like to mention a few of them at least?
Yes, I can mention a few of them. So I think it's as you expect. So the UK is one of the big trends drivers countries. Finland, I think the only one that's not actually between Europe and the Americas is, I believe, China has become quite a big contributor.
Yeah.
But other than that, those are the countries. Sorry, actually, it's not China. It's South Korea. It's South Korea.
Okay.
That's the only one that's not sort of in the West. And these are the 6 countries which at least a systematic review has shown for the past decades have been the determinants of what we called megatrends.
Brilliant. That's wonderful. Can I come to Molloy? Do I call you Molloy or Lhasa? Which one do you prefer?
Both.
Both. Okay.
But you can go any direction.
Lhasa Molloy. Okay. I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name, but I always give the freedom for people to mispronounce my name so that I hear how my name sounds in another language. I hope you would feel the same. So I feel freedom for people to mispronounce me.
Yes.
Yes. So I want to come to your book, and from what you said earlier as well, your book, Developing Africa, New Horizons with Afrocentricity, where you critique the dominant narrative of development and showed the need to decolonize development thinking. Could you tell us about your book briefly in relation to this topic, starting with, for instance, its cover? It has a very intriguing and interesting cover. I may not be able to show it here due to my technical difficulties, but I hope you can say a few words about that. And tell us as well about the two or three central arguments, the most important points in your book that you think are very important for decolonizing developments, thinking or practice in Africa, or even beyond.
I think in terms of how that book is conceptualized as relates the title, it puts the question of developing Africa as a question mark.
Mm-hmm.
And then it takes a particular philosophical standpoints in the re-narration of the idea of development as a philosophical thinking frame through which the subject matter is approached. And the cover of the book is reflective of the sketches that are manifestive of dryness, brokenness that this continent is experiencing or has experienced. And it's also reflective of the brokenness of 1884, 1885 belling scramble of Africa, in which Africans were not part of the meeting, but Africa was part of the menu being scrambled, and it was called the piece of cake which they needed to dine on. So in a way, if you look at the middle of the cover of the book, you see a new seed that is bursting into that shame of brokenness. But it has the roots that are rooted in something that is ancestral. And that seed is a seed of hope that when people are organized on the basis of the idea of history, their culture, and they stand up and assert their own agency, they can be able to rise again. First of all, I argue that the conceptualization of the idea of development driven under the dictum of Euromodernity project that is rooted in the voyages of discovery arising in the late 14th century that culminated with the Belling Scramble were hidden and masqueraded around the idea of spreading civilization, Christianization, and mercantilism. And so the aftermath of the Second World War in 1945, when Harry Truman in 1949 announced the Point 4 program, we see what we call epistemic solipsism, which is the right of an American president to define what development is without the involvement of the people for whom development is intended for. Therefore, I make an argument that the idea of development, it's a concealment of evil that hides the logic of Berlin Conference. Therefore, who defines development controls the agenda and the narrative. Therefore, I see the European modern project that is called development as a decivilization, deculturalization movement that insults the humanity of African people, in the line of what G.W.F. Hegel said in the 1800s when he spoke about African people having not set even the feet in Africa, that they have no culture, they have no history, they have no identity. Therefore, we will go down and civilize them. I therefore present the discourse of development entrapped within the Euromodernity project as an epistemic anomaly that has nothing to do with African people, but as an agenda that conceals the evil manifestation of the others. Therefore, in order to overcome that, we need to ask a question: who are Africans? And what does development as progress means? And when you take the philosophical approach that is grounded at home, we would know that colonialism was an act of violence against the indigenous people. So when you say Africans, we would need to be reflective on whether we are taking the indigenous perspective or we are taking a neoliberal approach that simply says everybody that is born in here is an African. And I think the ANC fell into that trap in 1955. And even the rest of the project of OAU collapsed into the logic of Berlin and could not redeem the native Africanist discourse, who are the violated people, to have a right to define who they are and to determine their destinies. So in a way, when you take the oppressors and the oppressed, you put them in one box, and then you are defining development for them, you are actually massaging on the issues you are not even beginning to talk about. Who and for what is development intended for? So I think those are the central argument in which I'm then calling for African people to be grounded on the basis of their idea of history, their culture, and their own agency. For development cannot be broad, but it comes from the people and from the environment they occupy. It cannot be straight-jacketed. We cannot imitate somebody else's image, for we too are created in the image of God as we look at the cosmos and life. And we therefore must make an input in defining the essence of our lives. I'll pause there.
Thank you. Those are very insightful remarks, which we will also try to unpack later on. Very important points. If I come to you, Eyob, as well, you have done enormous research in not only knowledge production, but also how decolonial education has to be. And I remember reading in the book that you contributed a chapter on voices from the darker side of development. Your way of teaching students in the UK, I think in London School of Economics at that time, how you were trying to incorporate these decolonial and critical voices from the continent to broaden the epistemic horizons of the students. So based on your research on the politics of knowledge and how you produce decolonial insights on the economic and political realities of Africans, especially young people, can you give us some compelling findings that illuminate on why and how we can decolonize, or we should decolonize development? Should we have development? And if we have, in whose terms, or in what language, or in what way? What do you think?
Thank you, Irga. It's really a privilege to speak, especially after Getchi and Lehasa, because they set the most important parameters within which that I really would like to make a contribution. For me, the most important aspect is the epistemic location. From whose point of view that we are speaking about development. And both as Getchi and Lehasa have articulated it very eloquently. So far, development have been defined and imposed, both present and the future, primarily from the position of the global north or from Europe. So in that context, for me, decolonizing that, yes, it can be a good engagement, but I won't really see it as something that would be even a success. We have already, I think, entered into an impasse about decolonizing development. So most importantly, I would rather want us to come up with kind of to embrace our locus of enunciation, our speaking point, our point of departure, and decenter it, decouple it from the global world, from Europe, which has been on the driving seat of colonialism and neocolonialism. So if you want to speak about the politics of academic knowledge production in development, so it has been primarily driven by this very universalistic, Eurocentric logic that defined Africa as a place of lack, primarily as a place of deficits and nothingness. So everything has been driven from that point of view. So in my experience of teaching students, especially at the London School of Economics, when I was teaching the African development, I tried to provide at least for the mainstream thinking of development and the alternative ways of thinking about development. As Getty was saying, we can define, for instance, agriculture or education through how the World Bank defines education and agriculture in terms of property rights, in terms of increasing production. But if you see it from the position of Africans, for instance, agricultural land is not just simply a property that it can put a price tag on it and then just simply commodify and sell it on the market. Land in most African societies is too precious, too valuable that it cannot monetize it. It cannot put a monetary value on it. It belongs to the unborn. It belongs to the dead, the present, the living, and the unborn. So it's something owned. It's not a private property. So if we speak about African development or agriculture from that point of view, we will definitely come up with different ways of raising questions. In terms of education, what we've been studying about education in Africa is, of course, the World Bank has been imposing only primary education and the irrelevance of higher education in Africa through the structural adjustment period, whereby African language were somehow disregarded. You've already worked on this project for yourself as well, Irga, whereby both English and French become just the only ways with that people become educated by disowning the language from which that they can speak about multiple of things, both the abstract and the material. But that element was somehow disregarded for the sake of education, modern and civilized education. So through that process, development has been more of somehow the reinforcement, the embodiment of the colonial project in different shape and form. So it's epistemic orientation, so it's institutionalization, so it's practices. So Africans has always been on the receiving end of the development agenda. They were not the master of defining what development is for them. So, in my honest opinion, I don't think that decolonizing development would work, would take us any step forward. I would rather speak about emancipation or liberation, so that we speak from the lived experiences of Africans, both in the past and the present, so that we can imagine things from the position where we are. Otherwise, we will always be followers of an agenda that has not been defined through our meaningful contribution. We can be the master of our emancipation. Africans do not own their own development agenda. As we speak, most African countries are just simply following the conditionalities that the IMF and the World Bank or the OECD is putting for them. They don't invest in their education, health, infrastructure, or development because they have to service their debt. So there is no development that's owned by the continent and African citizens. So decolonizing it, I don't think will take us any further unless we define it from our own priorities. That's what I would like to say, at least at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you. I think those are very insightful points as well. We'll come back and maybe interrogate some of those points, especially the language of emancipation, which is very important, the language of liberation, which is very important, and how do we enact those languages, maybe revive them from the legacies of the post-colonial liberation movements and so on. And given the things that followed, how can we really come back to that language of liberation rather than development would be very fascinating. And I think we are also discussing about education by linking it with development, as you might have experienced it in your different countries as well. When I grew up in Ethiopia, we always think education is a precondition for development. So we're learning in order to develop. We don't develop, we don't act and learn from our actions. We must be educated first in the classroom, separated from the world of development or activities, be indoctrinated, educated in order to reach at those developed countries for development. If I come to you, Jesse, following on these conversations, and it's really fascinating, especially to see some of the terminologies you use in terms of urban and rural in Africa, and the question of land and the epistemic lens with which we understand these things. And it's fascinating in a way, especially for Africans, because the majority of Africans in many parts of the continent are rural people. If you go to Ethiopia, 80%, 78% of the population live in rural places. Even a few decades back, it was like 90% or 92% in the 1960s. In other, even sub-Saharan African countries, I'm following simply the World Bank's statistics. You find that most Africans are rural farmers or rural people. But the thinking around development, around progress, is very much centered on the city and urban spaces. Given your critical engagement in this area of urban spaces and in relation to how the people live on the ground, what are being lost in the conversation about progress, about development, that we have to abandon or cut off or probably reframe and change? Given a lot of the conversation is not even about the people, because the people don't live the way Europeans or people in the North live.
I think this is a really great question, because I think what we mean by urban and rural in many ways is not as static as the textbooks would have us take it. What you say is true, but has been changing quickly. So by a lot of formal definitions, Africa has urbanized quite a bit. So whereas a lot of, I would say probably East, Central, West Africa is still going through its urban boom, as they like to call it, the North and the South has largely significantly urbanized. South Africa, where I live now, by the numbers, is over 70% urbanized. North Africa, 90%. Now, the question is, what does it mean? And I used to use these numbers quite often in my discipline until I also began to interrogate them, because there is research now saying, but well, we're saying urban in relation to looking at certain territories on a map. And saying that the characteristics of these places, either in terms of the physical built environment or the predominant modes of production, appear to be urban. But that's a very particular lens on what it means to be urban. In fact, I live in the city of Johannesburg, where I would argue a good number of people who don't live very far from me are living fairly rural existences in what is otherwise called a city and a very urban place, because they are, some of them, still growing food. They're certainly not deriving the benefits of what the city claims to offer, and in many ways see themselves as very connected to land, and they're worshipping in waterways, and they're traveling to a rural home every weekend. So they don't see themselves defined by cityness or by what the texts might call what is urban. So I think in many ways it's a complex issue, what is urban in the context of Africa. Certainly the dynamic of people moving to more primate locations is a dynamic we have seen, and that growth has been real. But what it means to live an urban life, what it means to desire an urban life, I think is something that, coming back to Ayob's point, we have to make sense of in our own terms. And I think, Yega, you're very much saying the same thing. I want to come to a comment you've made about education being a precondition to development. I actually think in a strange way it is. I think a particular kind of education is the absolute precondition to a particular understanding of development. Because in these books, we are taught these ways. We are taught that this is what it looks like. And therefore, in many ways, we critique and chase a better form of development. But perhaps development is doing exactly what it's supposed to. And that's what is defined in the books we read. So I worry sometimes that for many of us, and for myself, for example, as an urbanist, my job then is not just to come to a university and learn about urban planning. It's to come, understand that I'm invisible, then understanding I have to unlearn some things, and then figuring out what I have to learn, why I have to learn it, how I'm going to learn it, and how I'm going to justify it in an environment that will tell me that that is not the right understanding of the issue. So then I have to defend this new knowledge I want to bring in and then to pursue it. And this is the laborious task of the Global South, I think, in the Knowledge Project. It's an emotional labor, it's an academic labor, and it's something that some of the world has not had to do. And I think it's also something to acknowledge then. So we're constantly having to redefine and question these definitions and these understandings, even of urbanization.
Yeah, I think those are very interesting points. Hopefully, Lhasa Moloi will reflect on. I think one of the points is we've been thinking about development and education in a way of, for instance, education for all projects. One of the ways in which education was presented with education is a human right. But what is being given in most universities and high schools is Western education, like in Ethiopia, it's in English, or the content's Western. So the human right to education is the human right to Western education, and that way of incorporating our way of thinking and imagining development in relation to the indigenous and the epistemologies you were talking about, Lhasa. It will be interesting to reflect on what it means really to think with the people, with Africans, in relation to development that has not been real part of their experience. If experience it is, it has been experienced by them as a form of dispossession and relocation and so on. So
Professor Paula Moya introduces a concept called the interpretative horizon, which speaks to the inseparability between politics of identity and the production of knowledge. Who you say you are determines what you're going to say. In 1933, in the land of the Americas, Professor Carter Goodwin writes a book titled The Miseducation of the Negro People. You see, whoever plants the ideas in your head becomes your God and controls your imaginations and your interpretation of reality and how you look at the world. What we consider to be education, it's a miseducation program. It deculturalizes you. And this is why European education system, it's very naughty, and it is a program that captures the psychology of African people to look at the world from where the European man and a woman is standing. And there's always been a phrase that says, monkey sees, monkey does. So in a form of mimicry, which is what development was about. If you look at 1958, the work of Daniel Lerner, he spoke about, we therefore need to inject these people with our own cultural values. So the main reason why I speak in English is because I had to learn it. But I have another language that I speak. So I'm therefore saying that the agenda of European education system has always been about targeting the psychology, which is why the late, great Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o talks about the effects of the cultural bomb and how it annihilates African people's identity to mimic and speak as though they are Europeans, thus casting a negative eye to their own identities. When I introduce myself, I have a name and I have a clan name. Both the name and the clan name has a historical context. And I always feel that when W.E. Du Bois spoke about the crisis that is created by double consciousness, what Molefi Asante calls consciousness and tortured consciousness. African people imagine themselves as though they are Europeans, and then they are not. They were violated. So I think a true education must lead to self-actualization, beginning with our clan names. So in a way, the way we would therefore think of, Africa, I am pro chronological approach to historical interpretation. To understand Africa, we must move in its antiquity, beginning with Nubia and Kemet. And we must understand what Africa went through, the invasion of the Persians, the invasion of Alexander Salt called the Great, the Romans, the Arabs, until in the past 500 years, the invasion of the Europeans. So I'm then saying that African people were enslaved, but not that they are the slaves. So Europe interfered with the progress that Africa was making. Next to me here in Mpumalanga, you have Inzalo Yelanga, and then you have the great achievement that have been achieved by this continent. Not only that, the fact that Africa is a cradle of humankind. The Homo sapiens were born in this continent. We are therefore not the last. So my argument is that if we can make a history that begins the narrative of development located in the history of Africa, we will realize that Europe interfered with the progress that Africa was making. So when we look ourselves in the image of our own ancestors, it changes our attitude, it builds our confidence, and we also can be able to stand up and compete with the world at an equal level. What we have at the moment, if I take the words of Marcus Mosiah Garvey, he says, we shall neither look to the west nor the east, but we will look to ourselves for our own salvation. So what we firstly need to do, we must feast the self-concept of an African. And then, what then that does, if I stand in front of the class and I revitalize the memory of the greatness of our own ancestors, we begin to look at European knowledge completely differently. So what I'm then seeking to say is that there are two layers. We are Africans entrapped within Eurocentrism, but we are not Europeans. So in a way, if we can remove this layer that has covered us, we will speak from a located perspective, and then we will look at the stars. We will look at Musiwa Tunya in Zimbabwe and not call it Victoria Falls. We will begin to throw away Western clothing and come back to our own art of creativity. As it is at the moment, we may be wearing shiny Chinese clothing. We may be having the headquarters of AU that are built for 54 nation states by China as a meeting place for corruption to take place. How can it be possible that 54 nation states are built the headquarters by Chinese and not expect that China will have an influence? So what I'm simply making an argument is that we need an education system that throws off Western agenda, that builds the confidence of African men and women to claim their cultural pride and also to bring something to the table of the world and not be dependent beneficiaries who are bringing nothing. I'll pause there.
Great insights. I see a strong affinity among all of this, the thoughts reflected by all of you. And it's really interesting because we have come to somehow to internalize this narrative, or this deficit narratives, which tend to make us forget that even the very survival and existence of Africa throughout all these periods of oppressions since the period of slavery until today, and how we live and survive and move forward, in itself is a manifestation of the resilience and the greatness that is buried behind these narratives. And I think that is what we are trying to tap into. How can we actually express that energy, that whether we call it indigenous or African or in the family, in the cultures, how can we liberate those energies, those insights, and make them part of what we call education or development or otherwise. And if you can a little bit unpack that and add some insights, Eyob, also reflecting on your work on young people in particular, I think in Africa, there has been the experience of resistance and trying to make the world better, but somehow some of those attempts fall back because they depend on an epistemic construction of a world totally a world that totally alienates African way of existing, way of producing, way of becoming. So how do you see, for instance, this language of emancipation and liberation manifested in the struggles and language of young people in your research, and also how in the global landscape of knowledge production and education and the institution of development, like the likes of the IMF and World Bank, so how are these things being somehow stifled or made unusable and rendered to the circumstance in which we are now today? So as a scholar, as a young scholar as well, how do you see the future holding? Is promising, or what do you think we can do to decolonize these processes?
Yeah, it's a very challenging, but definitely it's a mission worth dying for, honestly speaking. If we speak about education and the miseducation of African young people, then that's where the problem is. You know, the human resource is the most potent aspect that Africa can definitely use to protect itself and also to project itself into the future. But if this young population is miseducated, it's educated through this deficit model that Africa has been just simply live off the charity of the global north, will definitely be that will be the problem. At the moment, we have several Africans, young people, migrating and dying in the Red Sea, in the Mediterranean, trying to cross, trying to reach the promised land of the West, the imagined savior or the heaven. Whereas because the system has been always portraying the continent as a place of deficits. But that was not the reality, in fact. In the period, because we don't own the narrative, we don't define development. In the period, for instance, of the implementation of the so-called the Millennium Development Goals between 2000 and 2015, Africa has been the net creditor to the world. The amount of resource that was extracted from the continent was much more significantly higher than the amount of resource that comes through either aid or foreign direct investment or what have you. And particularly between the year 2013 and 2015, Africa lost almost $86.9 billion. All this resource could have been invested in a way that would educate our young people in a way that they would know themselves better in our curriculum, we don't study about the struggles of, for instance, what Lumumba has tried to do and what kind of tragedy happened because he tried to claim the definition of development for his people. What has happened to Sankara. But what we've been always been studying is how Europe came and kind of imposed its own developmental orientation across the continent. So in a nutshell, the miseducation of the young people has continued to make them more of like, to be more to the disservice of the broader agenda rather than people who become like on the driving seat of shaping the narratives, of reorienting these misguided engagements, this off-track aspect of pursuing development whereas reinforcing colonial relationships. But the majority of young people are also growing up in a structure that we are currently kind of critiquing. So the system has to somehow, and they will always be on the lower end of the power dynamics, because you may not have the resource, you may not have the language, you may not have the capacity to engage with the system adequately or critically, and what's being provided is a system that will just simply turn the majority of Africans just as consumers. Now we have the very growing young population, so now Africa is just simply portrayed as a marketplace, as a source of data, or if you speak from the position of Europe, it's somehow considered, African young people are considered as migratory danger. So, there was one famous speech made by a senior European Union official saying that Europe is the garden and the rest of the world is the jungle. And most African young people are considered as invaders coming from the jungle to the garden, right? So the way that we can kind of counter such kinds of portrayal, undignified, dehumanizing approach, discourse about Africa and about African young people is to educate and to learn through our emancipatory orientation, through our own language, so that we embrace who we are and value the system for which that we grow up, rather than just simply. But the problem is the elites, the ones that have both political and economic power, very much in alignment with the existing dominant Eurocentric knowledge and development framework, will always be the one who will take advantage. And I don't think such kinds of engagement, such kind of critical, emancipatory, liberatory orientations would be of their interest. Of course, it should always be a struggle. It will always be a struggle, and this struggle was dying for us, as I said earlier.
Absolutely. And I think a struggle by itself also sometimes becomes a way of life, because life is lived in a process. Sometimes people expect us to live in a different planet, not to complain, not to talk about our suffering, to deny the very existence of all the problems that we are experiencing, and to come up with ideals and solutions that are not available with us at the moment. So I think that those are very important reflections, and I want to come back to you, Gachi, and I think one of the very fascinating things for me is the question of the future. And many people ask, do we even have a future? We have seen, for instance, some billionaires like Elon Musk saying that the greatest threat northern countries face is lack of children. But in relation to Africa, we see the same or similar people from that class or that circle saying that the greatest threat of the future or the present is the African population, the existence of many children. And you can see that many people question, what is the future if the future is already defined today by saying who is eligible and who is not? So what are the things that makes you think or worry when you think of the future in relation to Africa? Do we have a future? What are the ways in which we can assert our existence in spaces, urban spaces, rural spaces, in any spaces, to be able to exist with all our peculiarities and our contributions to the world?
No, thank you for this. I think the thing that concerns me most about the future is something Fry called defuturing. And defuturing would be this idea that there are people who don't exist in a future, but more importantly, don't have a right to define what a future could be. And I think this is, from everything the colleagues are saying here, is something that has, if you want, been done to us through colonization. Is this defuturing? Is that the terms for even being present in the future become defined in a certain way? For me, the decolonial project, which I do kind of still hold on to, I think is about that. I think for me, it's less about centering the colonizers, because maybe further to Lehasa's Garvey quote, there'll always be somebody, I mean, whether it's the West or the East, there'll always be somebody who might want to take that position of suggesting ways of being. But if you cannot yourself claim the space to determine how you want to think about the future and how you want to imagine the future. So imagination is the only tool we have actually for engaging with the future. When people talk about, oh, the fertility rates are what is going to get us, or climate change is what is going to get us, or economic collapse is what is going to get us, or nuclear armament is what is going to get us, the world could end tomorrow. There are many things that could get us. The reality is we have no idea, and we are not by far the oldest species on this planet. So the planet probably will continue for a long time, even without us. I think what we have, and so when Eob speaks about emancipation or liberation, for me, the greatest freedom is that freedom to imagine, is that freedom to decide what parameters, what assumptions, what constraints you choose to accept about the future. And so a lot of my work currently is about this, is about coming to that place of imagination. And I love when you say who is eligible, because I immediately translate that to who is eligible to think about the future. And one of the articles that we put out just 2 years ago is actually called The Future as a Public Good. Because in fact, the future for many has not been a public good. It's been a private good that a few people decide what can be thought about, what methods will be applicable, as Eob has been saying, which indicators will be applied, and those become the parameters for futuring. So I think we have to decline defuturing. I think Lehasa gives a number of suggestions of alternative starting points. I'm not sure if I always agree. So I'm not much of a traditionalist myself. I do believe in ancestral knowledges and wisdoms. I think there are stolen paths that we have, but I don't know if those are the only starting points. I think there are multiple starting points, and some of them are in the present and different ideas of the future. I think we have to be open to exploring all of that, because I do think there is a mythical missed opportunity to have been a particular kind of African that may not be available to us now. We have to be where we are. And I think we can draw on certainly what is best from our indigeneity, but I do embrace the idea. And when I work with young people, I am just sometimes amazed by some of the ideas they have, which have nothing necessarily to do with anything, necessarily from a particular past, but come from their imaginations. And I'm very excited about this. I think we have many different narrative starting points from which to move forward, but we absolutely have to liberate and own our location. I think, as people have been saying, we have to be grounded in some idea that we can assert our existence, to use your words, that we have a right to imagine futures.
Yeah. I think that's very, very powerful, and it always also comes back to that notion of having this vision of, or this struggle, a continuous struggle of emancipation and liberation as being central to our lives. It may not be central to many people, but for many Africans who are living under existing, since colonial times, structures of institutions or knowledge systems and so on. And that becomes very important. And the question of location, which also you touched on, I want Lhasa Moloi maybe to expand that a little bit more, because one of the very interesting things you started to say was Africa as a seed pre-existence or existence already there. It is there. It is knowledge, it is traditions. But since the Berlin Conference, something has been there, and Africa was turned into some kind of a meal or a recipe to be consumed. And I think the challenge also, I think, is that we have now come a long way, learning the languages, developing the same kind of desires, the desire to be, to consume, to participate in a world. And also we have contributed to this world. With the laptops we have now, we're using this technology. A lot of what we already use is part of Africa, because our resources, the African precious minerals, resources have been taken away unjustly and have become part of the global civilization or progress or advancement, whatever you call it, innovation. That also includes our resources. We have a stake in it, although we are denied when it comes to the narrative of, who belongs to this period, who is contributing to innovation, and so on. So what are those thoughts, those ideas that we can ground on? You've mentioned a little bit about Egypt, for instance, which is very interesting. So are there ideas that could lead us towards the people? These are simply directions that would help us assume the epistemic location, that space our people hold.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. Let me also take from where Professor Gessi left off. The fear of history is very problematic when it comes to finding location. We normally say that if somebody is lost in terms of a direction, you need to retract the steps and go back home. When people have been displaced from who they are and they were renamed and given English names, and they were told that adoring the ancestors is a sin and they need to be born anew and adopt new names, they become trapped in the discourse of self-hatred. And I have started by saying our names and clan names are telling a story of the ancestral river that is moving. And when I say looking at the past, I'm simply saying not past ourselves. We always have to pay homage to the processes that have brought us through. And we must then be able to study the nature of the problems that we have, which are cast within the context of a place and space. If we have to explain why, as an African, I speak in English, it will speak of the presence of Great Britain. Why in Mozambique and Angola, those who look like me speak in Portuguese? Why Francophone Africa? This is Berlin Conference coming alive to say that besides English, there is another language, as the Mosotho in South Africa, that I can speak. And which is why I think for me, we are not advancing the discourse of hate. We are correcting the mess that has actually been created by Europe of monoculturally Zim, it's not that African people are not creative. If you look at our work of aesthetics, the beauty in clothing, and our manifestation is telling a particular story about our own ability. And for me, one of the biggest problems that I have with this idea of development that always is straight-jacketed, oh, Africa must be saved, oh, Africa must be developed, oh, Africans are sinners, bring the Bible, oh, Africans are lost, bring the Quran. In a way, any narrative that disconnect people from their ancestral land and their ancestors, its starting point is very shallow, because the very people that we are looking at them to be bringing development, they go with the images of their own ancestors. They have rituals. So we don't live outside of culture. I mean, in my own context, African people, in terms of the celebration of rituals, they will talk of a traditional wedding, after that, white wedding, which shows the entrapment into double consciousness. But so, as much as I say, I am not saying I'm so much of a purist who suggests that we can find something that is pure. But I'm saying, looking back to understand how we came about, to understand the present, and rethinking and reframing the future. Maybe, one of the leading scholars and the president of Africa, Kwame Nkrumah, when he did the book on Keynesianism, he suggested something that is very important. He said Africa must be studied in its own traditional structure, in its own religionized Western character, so that we are able to find ways of how we redeem the human spirit. I don't think, number one, development of Africa should be about, taking technologies from China, and then saying that we are developed. Development is not infrastructure, it's multifaceted. People create technologies to survive their own conditions, to show that the West has imposed itself. When African people are building a church, they build it with a particular model and a blueprint that shows the presence of Europe and in the way of thinking. When we look at how African people design the structures, the roundavels through the head, they are showing the creativity of what relates to their own environmental context. Now, what we have actually taken, borrowed from others without looking at our own creativity, sometimes they're unfriendly to our own environment. So I'm then saying that, in fact, it is European who called us backward and traditional, while they are insisting on the violent path of using weapons of mass destructions, as we have seen, and of killing people. So I'm saying that to reach out to Ubuntu, there is no future without reviving the human values and learning to share. And I therefore make that argument that we should not just look at development in terms of infrastructure to say we need buildings, yes, to use them for human beings, but also social organization of our own structures. Our own traditions must be celebrated as we hand over to the coming generation. So my point is that to live in a true multicultural world, multilingual world, does not mean we must forget who we are. Let me end on this point. Ubaba Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Professor Kwesi Pra are very emphatic on language. They are saying, if you know your mother tongue and you add on it all other languages, you become a very great person. But if you know all other languages and then you ignore your mother tongue, you are dislocated, because it is in your language where you get the concept, where you interpret your environment and what you see around. So the point I'm therefore saying is that a future that is based on the current project of straight-jacketed ideas that are coming from the West, that are coming from the East, hold our own creativity to be able to say, what are your own opinions in terms of how you can make certain technological inventions? So I'm saying African people are not just sitting, waiting for products to come in China, to come from China or to come from Europe. Look and study them, how they make their own creativities and contribute to the world. So if we come to the table of negotiations as we met in Bandung Conference of 1955, and we don't come with any culture, we don't come with any creativity, we become swallowed up by the Chinese, we become swallowed up by the West in the name of development, yet without our own contributions. So I was saying we need to unleash the spirit of our own creativity to be able to work with others while we are able to bring something. And through a decolonial education, we are able to firstly uncross the crossed mind through colonial education and begin to bring something else that is more beautiful that Africa can give to the world, not just to become dependent beneficiaries who are consumers, yet who are presented without an ability to think. So for me, that should be the starting point in how we reimagine the future. But as it is at the moment, yes, I'm not denying that we are wearing shiny Western clothing, which is very beautiful. We don't have a problem with practicing multiculturalism with others. But we also have something else that we are carrying with ourselves, that we are giving to the world. Our way of cooking, our way of aesthetics, you know, and for me, that is what I think is important in unleashing the African spirit. We are not born merely just as consumers of what is brought, but we also have something that we can give to the world. Thank you.
Absolutely. I think we're not necessarily advocating, as I hear you, that we can go to the past and live in the past. And when people try to reduce the argument of having African indigenous or African voices to be part of politics, to be part of progress, they kind of have a way of thinking, of saying that these are simply nostalgia, trying to go to the past, which is dead and so on. No, we belong to the present. And it's surprising how people allocate what is present now into the past. For instance, I do research around Ethiopian manuscripts in European museums and libraries. They are artifacts. So studying them is going to the past. But in Ethiopia, they are living textbooks in the indigenous Abna traditional education system. People use them. People practice Ubuntu. People live, transmit their rituals and traditions, and denying the legitimacy of those experiences from becoming part of what we call development or education is a form of exclusion that we are trying to resist. And if you can add a little bit more on that, Eyob, we are coming to the possibly last of our reflections. I will give you one more last chance to say only the words that you haven't said so far after Eyob give us some reflection on what has been said so far. And also, if you can also add on a question presented on the chat about the African Development Bank. The question is, the Africa for Development Bank, is it fit for purpose given these ideas of emancipation and liberation? Or is it designed on other multilateral institutions of the global north? And that would be interesting if any of you also want to add to the person who asked that on the chat. Eyob.
Okay, thank you. I will reflect on the African Development Bank question. But before that, I want to comment on the future of development, or what does the future hold. And one particular issue that I would like to raise is also going back to the question of location, epistemic location, from what point of view that we are imagining the future. Because what we have at the moment is I think we need to question, how do we understand time? At the moment, the dominant understanding of time is just simply one way of understanding time. And it's not the only way that societies across the world conceptualize or know or relate to time. The dominant orientation is time is a linear process. So you always have a clear past, a clear present, and you also imagine for a clear future, and which also fits with the capitalist and imperialist orientation of fighting or doing whatever that you need to do to be on the front, to be in control of the future. And that's why we have all the process of, destruction. Nature is translated, is somehow considered as a resource to be looted, to be extracted, and do whatever you want, even for your own destruction. This is one, but we can recognize it is one way of knowing about time, but it's not the only way of knowing time. Not every society considers itself that its progress is on a linear process. Some societies consider time as a cyclical process. There are multiple ways of understanding temporalities. So I think whenever we speak about the future, we cannot take it for granted that there is one particular understanding of both the present and the future. So we should be very conscious and be humble in our approach of both understanding the present, the past, including the future, so that we will not be just simply replicating the problems or the wrongdoings that we have already somehow commented upon very articulately. So I think that's very important point to mention. It is within that context that we recognize what are the knowledge systems within the African context that has been somehow considered irrelevant to understand the present or the past or the future, because our language remain very much just simply, a space for just personal communication rather than scientific or academic knowledge productions. Yes, there are processes of understanding or producing academic scientific knowledge through our language, but the system is still very much closed. It's a closed gate, and we definitely have to challenge that. On the question of the African Development Bank, if you go to the details of how it is constituted, the African Development Bank, yes, it is an African Development Bank, but who owns the African Development Bank? If we go into the details of it, it's member states that are shareholders who determine the directions of the bank. Yes, African member states are shareholders, but also the United States of America, and there are also European countries are also dominant shareholders in the constitution of the African Development Bank. Yes, in its name, it's an African Development Bank, and it has been doing major infrastructure development programs across the continent. Yes, it has the name of the African in its name, but that doesn't mean that it has the right, at least in my opinion, it has the right institutional arrangement or epistemic orientation to address the issues that we discussed, at least in this panel. It is just a replica of how the World Bank operates or how European Development Bank operates within the African context with an African orientation. For that matter, using the, prioritizing the logics of the market, the logics of the finance sector or the logics of the banking system through, demand and supply, through property rights is not the only way through that we can achieve progress or transformation. It can be one way of doing it. And yes, I don't want to be too dismissive that there has not been any progress in terms of improving people's lives through infrastructural development, through education, health, electricity, and water or sanitation across the continent. However, the logic, the central logic, has not been challenged. So far, development, primarily economic development, has been just simply maintaining, the production of primary commodities from the continent for the service of the global north and for the consumption of what we don't produce. Yes, the bank can help us to address those issues, but it has been extremely tied up because the shareholders also constitute the global north, which has always been benefiting from the extraction of resources. And also, being an African, the skin color or your citizenship is not a guarantee that you will have a decolonial or an emancipatory epistemic orientation. So the naming doesn't really qualify that you can be at the service of the emancipatory project. It has to be testified and presented in your practices. That's what I would like to say. Thank you, Yoga.
Thank you. I think it's very interesting because when you think of it like a bank, the legitimate business of a bank is to make profit. And if you are allowed to make profits by making education policies, development policies on poverty, and the primary motive being having rate of return, a high rate of return or profit. And obviously that would create problems because if the bank is a genuine bank, of course it should make profit, and we allow banks to run our social institutions like education is quite telling. And I think these conversations are so wonderful, and I'm sure we could continue for a very long time, but we might have to conclude soon. I just want to have only one short round this time. Just share with us what you want to share as a last word. Of course, there's one question at the chat which you can reflect on, at least some of you, which asks specifically for young people in Timor-Leste, but it can apply for others, who are losing their identities, who are becoming victims to the development industry. What can the young generation do in a practical sense? So that I think helps us also to look into the future and also maybe to reflect from your own point of view, what you think development experts, because we try to engage and work with people who are earnestly trying to improve in their own way the lives of people through development. But we are skeptical of the existence of entrenched interests within that system. Eyob was talking about shareholders in these global institutions like the World Bank, the IMF. Africans have very insignificant, usually less than 1% of voting power, whereas the big countries have a significant voting power, which means that these banks are not global in a sense. We all don't have the same voice, just few interests are reflected, national interests are reflected through them. So in this reality, then what do we tell to people who earnestly or who want to really engage with the old way of engaging with development? Or what do you want to say? You don't have to follow my questions because my questions are a way of conversation. So what do you want to say as a last word about moving forward? Gassi, I'll start from you, Gechi, sorry.
Yes, no, I'm happy to start. I think it's interesting times for young people, and I think the language you use of them being victims to a development industry, I mean, that's heavy. But I think it's very real for many young people today. And I do think that we are faced with a kind of schizophrenia. I think I've begun to realize, and it's embedded in what Eyob was just saying about the DFIs, these finance institutions. Because when we say they are fit for purpose, of course, the obvious question is, well, what's the purpose, right? That we're asking, are they fit for? And if it's for a dominant current horizon we are on, this modernist colonized space we find ourselves in, then probably they are reasonably fit for purpose for these times. And indeed, we continue to have to survive in some ways with our shiny clothes, as Lehasa is calling them, on a day-to-day within a current horizon. And obviously, there are many people who, by choice or by default, find themselves firmly located in this horizon as their reality, and we get jobs, and it is an industry. You find yourself in that industry. And you can try and chip at it, but you can locate yourself within it. I think what we're talking about here is a different path where we aspire and work towards the more emancipatory project. And that project, and this herein is the schizophrenia, calls upon us actually to undermine those same systems, because those systems are not the ones that take us forward. That purpose, these systems are not fit for. It's not what they're designed for. It's not what they're developed for. And it becomes very difficult because to hold that kind of tension, that kind of complexity, is sometimes contradictory. It's sometimes very difficult. And I often find myself exactly in that schizophrenia. Vanessa Andriotti, I think, spoke about it well when she talked about the need to hospice modernity. And it's not just about that historical time or that colonial period. We are existing in unsustainable ways, right? It's unsustainable for us as people who seek liberation. It's unsustainable for the planet. It's unsustainable financially. And we see all of the ways in which the world around us really is, if it is development, it's a very undesirable form of development. The mindset of these times is what leads to the kind of violence, the kind of destruction that we see all around us. Now, on the positive side, I think we have other ways. We have other ontological starting points. We have, as Abe was saying, other conceptions of time. We have other ways of being that are available to us. In that availability is also the potential of not necessarily knowing. And when I call on us to think differently, and maybe this is what I would offer to young people, it is not necessarily because those would make things better for us. I am not necessarily sure that if we did things differently, if we decentered these knowledges, if we found ourselves in location, that the world would therefore be a better place. It might not be. It might be a very difficult place, but it would be a place of our choosing. It would be a place that we are open to and that we have appetite for. It would be a place, I think Lehasa is talking about confidence. And I think that's what we want to be available to. We had ways and we have ways of being, of knowing, of relating to each other that puts us in a different position. And I think I want to encourage young people to explore that. I went into university at 17 years old with a belief that I was going to learn something about how to be in this world. And like I said, I spent many years having to unlearn a lot of what was then offered to me. I hope our institutions that all of us are located in are offering something different to young people today. And we can complain about Gen Zs and their big-headedness, but part of that I think is an openness to cracks and to other explorations, and to me that's an exciting opportunity. I certainly invite people to engage with that schizophrenia, but to believe that we have different narrative starting points. We can be different.
That's wonderful. Lehasa Moloi, what do you think?
Professor Asante introduces the concept called victorious consciousness, that the purpose is not so much to dwell in oppression and what others have done. If somehow you happen to run in the street, you fall. And when you fall, you don't stay there. You rise up again, you shake yourself, you cleanse yourself, and you run to the future. And I want to say that to young people that are listening, sometimes there's nothing that is positive in politics, and we are surrounded by wars that we see, and we see the negativity which has been marketed through the social media, But I still think we have to fix the person on the mirror, which is yourself. And that for me is a starting point. We look back, we see people such as Amilcar Cabral, we see Stephen Bantu Bigo, we see Kwame Nkrumah, we see Julius Nyerere, we see Samora Machel. All this at a certain point in time were young people who live in those contexts. Today we look at Ibrahim Traore, and we are seeing a new phase of Africa. So I'm saying that to young people that are listening, start changing the world, beginning with yourself from your own context. And there's so much positive if we are looking for that we can find. Let us look the other direction and use the gift of our neck, which is turn away from evil and look towards the sun to see hope. And maybe you are the future that we are looking for. As Fanon said, that every generation must rise up to fulfill its mission or betray it. So I'm then saying that those who are studying, commit to the completion of your studies, commit to community development, and also charity will always begin at home. When we learn to practice Ubuntu and we learn to respect our parents, that is the basic foundation of the kind of the future that we'll create. And thereafter, go beyond your own context. Be interested in the globe. If possible, you gotta have few friends outside of your own context, outside of your own country, and break the barriers. And then maybe you will see something else that is different, that gives a shining light to the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think that's very enlightening. Eyob, last words.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to build on what Lehasa said about the victorious consciousness. That's why I think we definitely need to have emancipatory orientation embedded in our studies, even what I would call even emancipation studies, so that we base our thinking of progress or transformation based on our lived experiences, something that will emanate from our own location, from our cultural, from our successes and failures, from our troubles and victories. I think that's perhaps the most fundamental message that I would like to put forward. And also in relation to what our young listener from Timor-Leste raised about the challenge that young people are facing in that part of the world, I think it's very important to know that wherever we are, be it in the eastern or western hemisphere, in the global north or the global south, the negative impacts of empire, the negative impacts of imperialism would still affect us. The market forces are always on the hunting ground to get more resource and to dehumanize and somehow dislocate other people's culture and identity. So perhaps knowing that we are not alone, and to learn more about other people's struggle and to stand in solidarity with them. We are living in a moment where we've been, watching live how the West uses its military industrial complex, its advanced technologies, its media, whatever, to decimate the population of Gaza. We are witnessing that here. So I think we should always be in solidarity. We have to always learn how people are struggling. So what we are speaking about, as I was mentioning about history of the past centuries. But, what's happening at the moment is just simply a reflection, a continuation of what has been happening across the centuries. So we should always establish that solidarity and allyship and learn from other people's experience, so that we dwell on the positive, the energy, the victorious energy that would always drive us forward. Otherwise, we will always be somehow trapped into the pessimistic, the very defeatist position. And knowing ourselves, there is a saying, I think it's on Alice on the Wonderland, that it says, if you don't know where you are going, every road will take you there. Similarly, if you don't know who you are, everything will define you. So let's define ourselves, and let our emancipatory orientation be the one of the anchors upon which that we define ourselves, so that we also establish solidarity beyond physical boundaries. Thank you.
I think those are very, very powerful reflections, and one of the very interesting and impactful theme that seems to emerge from our conversation is the need for openness and the need to unlearn in order to get into that openness. And I think that's very, very important, because we are also embedded in the culture that we are criticizing. I work in an institution that is created, that is standing on stolen land. And it's very much important to acknowledge the existence of these complexities and paradoxes within us. And how do we actually self-decolonize? How do we see our own privileges? And if someone was to give me the opportunity to recreate new things for Africans, and if I want to say, yes, I can do it this way, then I could become possibly another colonizer, right? So I think that the question is, how do we become open, vulnerable, humble, and listen others in the quest of finding a better path that includes all of us? And that way of thinking about development is quite important, but we cannot do it without asking these hard questions, without that Victorian consciousness or that emancipatory spirit, because not to do that is to become complacent, to ignore the entrenchment, the existence of these entrenched structures and systems of power, which benefit so many people, including some of us, which have become part of that empire. So with that quest for self-decolonization, and also the willingness to be open and learn together, hopefully we will have more opportunities to engage in the future. The Development Studies Association of Australia is an organization that tries to bring different voices into conversation, critical conversations to happen, so that we become open, not too closed to the world. As the world is so complex, paradoxical, and multiple, we want to foster those ideas that could allow us to become many, one, and everything at the same time. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your insight. Thank you for your hard work and dedication. And thank you for allowing me to be your host in the name of Development Studies Association of Australia. And I also would like to thank the organizers behind, Lorenza in particular, and others, Deb and others, Anne, the president of DSAA, and all our members. Thank you for your participation, for enabling this conversation. Hopefully we will have another opportunity again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Yurga, for hosting us as well.
Thank you, colleagues.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was